to stop my video. I'm going to share my screen. Where is my, I don't see the place to share. Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. And I'm going to get this out of the way. Say okay here. All right. So welcome everybody to the final class, final presentation in this session on London Parks and Gardens. So this week we're going to be looking at two nature sites outside of the immediate London area. So we're going to be looking at Kew Gardens, which is still considered part of Greater London. It's in Richmond, so it is part of Greater London, but still not in central London. And also we're going to be looking at Windsor Great Park, and that kind of stretches the definition of a park the same way Richmond Park, you could argue, stretches the definition of a park. But we're going to be looking at both of those. They're both a short train ride away from London, so well worth a visit. And then finally, we're going to come back to London and finish up by looking at the Royal Horticultural Society's iconic Chelsea Flower Show. So let's go ahead and get started. But if you haven't, please mute your microphones. You know that routine. So we're going to start with Windsor Great Park. This is 4,800 acres. It's got parklands and forests. It has award-winning exotic gardens. It has a very ancient woodland. And it's witnessed countless events throughout history, dating all the way back to pre-Saxon times. And each time period has left its own distinctive mark on this landscape. So when we think of Windsor, we often think of the castle, which you can see here, obviously. But there's so much more to see if you go out here. Just like I said, the park is amazing in and of itself. So it wasn't until the 13th century that the areas making up Windsor Great Park were properly defined. But as I said, incredible amounts of different types of landscape over time, and obviously a very fascinating royal heritage here as well, because there are royal residences, and not just Windsor Castle. There are other royal residences here. Formal gardens, trees that have been here for over 1,000 years. So if we go all the way back to William the Conqueror in 1066, he used the landscape as a hunting ground. So almost, long ago. The long walk, which you see in this photo, which is the walkway leading up to the castle, that was planted and designed by Charles II in the 1600s. And then if we take it to the Victorian era, during Queen Victoria's time, she loved entertaining and having picnics on Virginia water, which we'll look at a little later, a little lake. And even today, there are royal connections, right? Because obviously, Windsor Castle is still here, and it is one of the residences of the monarchy. And the late Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, he was the ranger of the park for 70 years. And that role has now been taken over by his son, King Charles III. But as I said, if we go all the way back to 1066 with William the Conqueror, the Forest of Windsor, as it was called then, that was already established, and it was serving as a real vital resource for people who lived in the area. So just as we saw with Richmond Park, when we looked at that, remember I talked about the fact that people living there could collect firewood, they could graze their animals, bring their animals in. Same thing was happening here in this area. But William comes along, and as he did with the White Tower in London, better known as the Tower of London, that part of the Tower of London, William began building a fortress at Windsor, and he began building it around 1070. Now, at that time, it was little more than a stockade with not much, not the castle we know today. The castle we know today has really been constructed over subsequent centuries. But the outer walls of Windsor Castle, if you go, the outer walls as they stand today are the same walls which were constructed by William the Conqueror. So that's pretty amazing. And as I mentioned in the first week of the course, William liked to hunt. He created many hunting forests, Windsor included. So of course he wanted to come out here and hunt, and he put his little castle up at the time. And some of the original oaks that were planted during his reign 1,000 years ago can still be seen in the park today. Now, Windsor Great Park did undergo significant changes following the restoration of the monarchy in the 1600s, the mid-1600s. And many of the recognizable features that you can see today originated during that time period. So a lot of them date back to the 1600s. With the restoration came the introduction of formal avenues, again, most notably the Long Walk that you see in this photo here. And again, this was Charles II's idea. It's because he spent many years in exile in France after his father was executed. And he had a real fondness for French landscape architecture. So he was influenced by that. So here's a little map just showing you some of the places we're going to talk about today. I'm sorry, it's a little fuzzy, and I stole it from a from a touristy website, and that's why you see food stop favorites here. But it does a very good job of kind of laying out some of the places that we're going to look at today. And you can see there's quite a bit to see. So I mentioned Virginia Water a minute ago. In the mid-1700s, this was created under the stewardship of the then Ranger of Windsor Great Park, William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland. He was the son of George II. And he wanted a more natural and picturesque type of landscape. So he set about creating the largest man-made lake of its time, of its kind at that time in Britain. It was the largest one. He worked with architects and a topographical draftsman to do this, but he created this park because, again, Charles II was making the area more formal, more kind of French, and William Augustus wanted something more natural looking, so he created this natural lake. Now, today, the towering Cumberland obelisk that you can see here on Obelisk Lawn, this celebrates the work of the Duke of Cumberland at his time as Ranger of Windsor Great Park. So that's an obelisk you can go visit. And as you can see in the picture, people like to sit and picnic around here. And I mentioned that Queen Victoria liked to sit and picnic by Virginia Water as well. In later years, if we jump a little further ahead, the Prince Regent, later George IV, he recruited the help of an architect, Sir Geoffrey Wyatville. Wyatville was also responsible for remodeling Windsor Castle, but he got a hold of Wyatville and he said, okay, I want to introduce new features to the Virginia Water landscape, the area around the lake. He wanted a Chinese tea house, an Asian fishing temple. Now, these no longer remain. They were built, but they no longer remain. But there is still one notable structure partially in place. This is the Temple of Augustus. That's what it was called back then. And it consists of Roman ruins from what is now Libya. So these ruins were brought over from Libya. They came into the possession of Britain in 1816, when the Consul General convinced the local governor that the prince should be able to help himself to any of the ruins that he wanted. So in 1817, 22 granite columns, 15 marble columns, 25 pedestals, some loose slabs, and some other fragments from several building ruins were actually shipped all the way from Libya to England. Now, originally they were in the British Museum, but then at some point they were moved out to Windsor Great Park when the Prince Regent wanted to put them on display there. Between 1827 and 28, the building remains were arranged to look like a Roman temple, but to complete the temple, to make it look even more complete, Wyatville actually supplemented this temple with building materials from the demolished Carlton House in London, which was a residence of the Prince Regent. So when that house was demolished, they brought some of the materials out from there. Statues from Carlton House were also moved to Windsor to supplement the temple. And the finished construction stretched all the way from the shores of Virginia Water to Fort Belvedere, one of the royal residences. If you've heard of Fort Belvedere, it might be because it was connected with being the home of Edward VIII, who abdicated the monarchy to marry Wallis Simpson. Over the years, there was vandalism, there was deterioration of the temple. But in 2009, restoration work was undertaken, and so you can still see some of the remains today. Not what it looked like in the Prince Regent's time, but you can see some of the remains today. I should also note that ruins from this area, from Leptis Magnus, as it was called in Libya, were also pilfered by Louis XIV in the 1600s for his palaces at Versailles and his palace in Paris. So it wasn't just the Brits coming in and grabbing things away, but we know that there's a long history of this kind of thing going on. So it's a little odd. You're walking around, you know Windsor Castle, you might know some of the landscape, and then suddenly you come upon this Roman ruin, part of a Roman temple. So that's kind of cool. Now, I mentioned Virginia Water, which again, you can see here in the map, and you can also see right below it. There are the ruins I was talking about there. There's Fort Belvedere. So this temple reached all the way from there to there. It was quite a long distance when it was totally complete at that time. And I said, Queen Victoria loved this spot. She loved it from her childhood. So she loved picnicking around here. And when she was queen, her husband, Prince Albert, he had a very significant impact on Windsor Great Park. He really committed himself to improving the living conditions of the estate workers who lived in the park. He had cottages built for them. He established the Royal School so estate children could benefit from a thorough education. So he was very interested and invested in making this a very livable place as well for the estate workers. Now, the Royal School is still frequented by many of the children of the approximately 150 Crown Estate employees who live at Windsor today. And you can see this equestrian statue. This is commemorating Prince Albert's contributions to Windsor Great Park. And this statue is near Smith's Lawn, where polo is played. This is another really beautiful area. This covers about 44 acres, the Savile Garden. It's an interconnected series of different gardens that include designed gardens and woodland areas. They have the hidden gardens, the springwood, the summer gardens, the New Zealand garden, the summerwood, the glades, the autumnwood, and the winter beds. So lots and lots of kind of interconnected gardens here. It was created by Eric Saville under George V and Queen Mary. And from 1932 to 39, Saville came in and he thinned out the old forest growth that was here. He created a woodland and bog garden amongst the kind of remaining canopy of mature trees that were left. He formed streams and ponds from the surrounding springs. There were underground springs, so he made streams and ponds from those. There was some neglect of this during the Second World War, but then the gardens continued to be expanded and developed after that to include a herbaceous border, rose gardens, as I mentioned before, peat beds, and a larger bog garden. And plants were brought in from all around Britain. And in 1951, to honor his work, George VI named the garden after Saville, and in a further mark of honor, he was knighted in 1955. So this is a favorite area. If you walk around here, it's really beautiful. The woodland bog garden has really beautiful moisture-loving perennials. And again, lots of mature trees, oaks and other trees. There's also a dry garden. So it's a garden that's comprised of plants that do really well in dry conditions. And as I mentioned, the rose garden, you can see some roses here in this photo, a formal garden with perennials. There's also a conservatory that you can go in. And again, those streams and pools that I mentioned that came up from the springs underneath, those all eventually feed into a larger body of water, which goes into Virginia Water. So very popular, nice place to walk around. And there's another photo there. And then adjacent to that, the Valley Gardens were developed in tandem from the late 1940s, kind of as an extension between the Woodland Garden, the Savile Garden, and Virginia Water. Now, again, these were created by Saville, but also by Hope Findlay. And there are about 250 acres here, and they're just kind of like these sort of undulating valleys, if you will. So just little hills and valleys going through. And there's kind of these twisty woodland tracks. There's a national collection of magnolia, rhododendrons, and azaleas, and you can see in this photo. And there are also Himalayan and Chinese birches. Now, the long walk I mentioned before. So from the castle gate up at the top there, to the foot of the statue of King George III, which we'll look at in a minute, the Long Walk measures 2.64 miles in length. As I said before, it was created by Charles II. At that time, he had a double row of elm trees planted the entire length of the route. So there were 1,652 trees planted, and that kind of created the basis of the landscape that we see today. In 1710, Queen Anne had a road constructed down the center, and you can see there's a road here today. So coaches could head out into the park on a comfortably smooth surface. So Queen Anne could leave Windsor Castle and have a very smooth surface for her coach to come down. A little way down from the castle, it's hard to see in this picture, and I don't think blowing it up was really going to help. Let me see. And no, not really. Sorry, you can't really see it in my photo here. But a little ways down from the castle is a street called Albert Street that kind of cuts across here. And you can drive through there, or Albert Road, sorry. You can drive through there, and that road heads into Old Windsor. So often cars will come through, but they'll go really slow because they want to look at the views on both sides. You can look up at the castle, you can look on the other side. And when you catch the light just right, if the sun is just right, this was taken very, very early in the morning. And you can see I love the way the shadows came across here when the sun was just coming up and it was early. So I mentioned the elms. Over the years, they were replaced by oak and horse chestnut and London plane trees. And at Park Street, the castle end of the Long Walk, horse chestnuts predominate there. But these trees have had problems over the years. So they had a bacterial canker outbreak in 2008. Their leaves went brown. They dropped very early on. In 2009, the canker was still apparent, but the trees looked a little bit better, and there was hopes that they would, revive. But then the following year, they had a really bad year again in 2010. 2011 was dry, so the blight was not as serious, but there was still evidence of this disease in the following years. They've sort of held on. There hasn't been a real marked deterioration since then, so they're still standing, but they're always a little bit under threat. This long walk is popular. It's so popular. You get tens of thousands of visitors, walkers, photographers, joggers. People are constantly going up and down the long walk, and it really is a beautiful place to walk. And it's also used by the royal family when they travel to Ascot for the annual races at the start of the summer social season. So again, what they do is they leave from Windsor Castle, they get in their carriages, they come down the long walk, and they go over to Ascot to watch the races. Now, perhaps less well known is the fact that at the castle end of Long Walk, that area was actually very notorious for prostitutes who used to ply their trade there in the 1800s. So they would kind of go hang out at that end of the at the Long Walk to get customers, if you will, clients, if you will. On the 19th of May, 2018, the Long Walk was packed with onlookers as Prince Harry and Meghan Markle came by in a horse and carriage on their wedding day. This was certainly, almost certainly, the largest crowd ever to gather on the Long Walk at that point. I am actually, can't see me, and I can't even see me, but I'm right around there someplace. I was right smack in the front. That's why I was up so early walking down the Long Walk the day of this wedding. It was my wedding anniversary, so I dragged my husband out there because I said, hey, we're here. Let's go see this thing. And my waiting paid off because I got this photo. So I was very pleased with that. But anyway, huge crowds that day. Now at the other end of the Long Walk, I mentioned that statue at the other end. So again, you can look all the way down here. At the other end, this is Snow Hill. Beautiful views of the castle. Really popular place for people to have summer picnics. And sitting atop Snow Hill is the Copper Horse statue. This is a monument to George III. It was created by a British sculptor named Sir Richard Westmacott, and it was erected in October of 1831. I have not been able to find, and I'm still looking, why it's called the Copper Horse. It's made of bronze. It was commissioned by George IV in memory of his father. And it's long been called the Copper Horse. Again, I don't know why, but Queen Victoria is said to have not approved of the name, and she supposedly once told a guest off who referred to it as the Copper Horse, and she replied, "You mean the equestrian statue of our grandfather." So she wasn't too pleased with that. But that's another real landmark that you can see. Now, I mentioned royal residences, plural, and I said that there were more residences on the within the Great Park other than Windsor Castle. Several royal residences, actually, and the grounds of Windsor Great Park. So Fort Belvedere, which I mentioned earlier, now privately leased. The Royal Lodge, which is the current home of Prince Andrew and his former wife, Sarah, Duchess of York. Frogmore Cottage, which for a short time was the home of Prince Harry and his wife Meghan. Cumberland Lodge, which is now leased out as a educational charity. And Adelaide Cottage, one of the 3 residences of the current Prince and Princess of Wales. So Belvedere, I think, is the one on the left here, and I think the one on the right is Cumberland Lodge, which is now being used as an educational charity. So that's Windsor. Again, a lot of people go to see the castle. A lot of people go to walk around the town, and they're both worth it. The castle is fascinating, and the town is a beautiful little town. But if you have time to spare and a good set of legs, I would highly encourage you to take some time walking through the open areas of the parkland. Okay, now we're going to come back toward London. We're going to come in a little bit, and we're going to go to Kew Gardens, about 300 acres. The precursor to these gardens started with Frederick, Prince of Wales. He was the son of George II. And he and his wife, Augusta, they were living at Kew Palace. There was a palace here, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. And while they were living there, Frederick was able to indulge his interest in gardening. But it was really his wife, Augusta, who founded the botanic gardens that we know today. And she continued to expand the early collections of Frederick. Frederick died suddenly at the age of 44 in 1751. But she really expanded the work and interest of his. She found great pleasure in developing the gardens, and under her direction, these gardens were greatly expanded. She involved a well-known botanist named John Stewart, also Reverend Stephen Hales, another botanist. And so she really created this world-class botanic gardens. Augusta was very interested in exotic plants. She started the Physic and Exotic Garden around 1759, bringing in a range of plants and trees from around the world. And by 1768, the collection contained 2,700 species. And Augusta also commissioned a series of follies. Follies are just basically ornamental buildings with no practical purpose to speak of. And we're going to talk about a couple of those in a minute, some of these buildings that she commissioned. Now, in 1772, her son, George III, along with Joseph Banks, who I mentioned when we visited the Chelsea Physic Garden, if you recall, they joined the gardens of Richmond and Kew Estates. And that is what today is the Kew Gardens that we know. Kew started to fall into disrepair after the death of Queen Charlotte, who was the wife of George III. She died in 1818. And George III actually paid his last visit to the garden in 1806, some months before he fell very ill himself. After being blind for a decade and having suffered from painful rheumatism and all kinds of other health issues, George III died in 1820, so 2 years after his wife died. And from that time on, the area really was ignored by the royal family. And in fact, George IV actually considered demolishing the whole place. They just weren't interested in it. However, in 1840, thanks to the great efforts by the Royal Horticulture Society, which was founded in 1838, or early 1830s, but that society and its president, who was at that time William Cavendish, the 7th Duke of Devonshire, they said, no, we've got to save these gardens. So the gardens were adopted as a national botanic garden and open to the public. So that's when it was open to the public. Between 1831 and 55, the palm and temperate houses were built. These were glass houses, greenhouses. And a new arboretum was laid out. There was also an herbal collection founded. And aside from burning down the tea house in 1813, they didn't burn it down. I mean, it burnt down. And there was a mass felling of trees during the Great Storm of 1987. The gardens have pretty much enjoyed a pretty stable life from the mid 1800s. So they lost the tea house, and there was that huge storm in the 80s. But other than that, it's been pretty stable. And here again, you can see a map of the area. So much to see here. Definitely worth a whole day walking around out here. Now, I mentioned Kew Palace a minute ago. It is the smallest of all the royal palaces. It was originally built as a fashionable mansion for a very wealthy London silk merchant named Samuel Fortray. So it was built in 1631. In the 1720s, the royal family, George II and Queen Caroline and their children, came out here. They took lease on the palace. Initially, it was called the White House. And they also leased several other houses in the nearby vicinity. Very small house, but they liked it because it was a place where they could live in a relatively private way, have normal lives without all of the formal trappings of royalty and ceremony and that kind of thing. And the gardens around it were cultivated as, just idyllic, a beautiful kind of pleasure area for them to be. This was a very popular area with the Georgians, so several generations of Georgian royalty ended up using Kew and nearby Richmond Lodge kind of as weekend retreats from intensely public life in town. And the palace is probably best associated with George III. He demolished the original palace, the one from the early 1600s, and he built the one that stands today. And he took refuge here when he was suffering from mental illness and physical problems. And it was in this palace that his wife, Queen Charlotte, died. And as I said, just a minute ago, George III also joined the gardens of Richmond and Kew together. So again, it was really coming into its own at this time. I do have another course that talks about London's historic houses and palaces. And in that course, we go in the house, we look at the palace rather. We talk about the palace in more detail there, but that's all I'm going to say about the house itself right now. But I do want to point out the gardens, the Royal Kitchen and Kew Kitchen Garden. So the Royal Kitchens and the Kitchen Gardens were supplying members of the royal family who were living at Kew Palace. So they were feeding them, basically. You can tour the kitchen block today, as you see in this photo, and it really does a great job of capturing the atmosphere of what royal kitchens were like at the time of the Georgian monarchy. In the 1730s, there would have been around 30 staff members who would have been very busy preparing food for Frederick, Prince of Wales, and his family. And the gardens were used for almost 80 years by the royal family whenever they were in residence at Kew. But again, after the death of Queen Charlotte, George III's wife, the doors were locked and the kitchen was left untouched for nearly 200 years. Now, what's interesting about this building today is it's the only remaining structure, the only remaining service building at Kew. So the stables, the dovecote, the laundries, all of those were demolished when the Royal Botanic Garden was developed and growing and getting bigger. So this is the only one surviving. And it's really interesting to kind of walk in there and look around. There's one picture from the inside. You can see this massive hearth, and they've got the spits where the meat would have been turned. And the garden outside is fascinating. I love this garden. I mean, I love Kew Gardens, but I just loved this little kitchen garden. It was so well put together. So it's planted with the kind of vegetables that would have been grown in the 18th century. And its produce today is used in the kitchens for the little restaurants and cafes at Kew Gardens. The main area of this walled garden is divided into 4 unequal plots. So there are gravel paths, and the paths, you can't see it in this picture, but they're topped with oyster shell chips because that's what would have been used in the 17th and 18th centuries. There's one bed dedicated to growing soft fruit, so things like gooseberries and currants and that kind of thing. The other three have a yearly rotation of crops with additional beds for artichokes, rhubarb, asparagus, strawberries. There are cherries, damsons, apple tree varieties that are lining the walls of this little garden. It's really delightful. And here are a couple more photos. So in addition to fruits and vegetables, there are pots of bay leaves and hollies, and you can see this bay tree on the right, which is just gorgeous. It was gorgeous when I was there. And those are placed near the entrance of the garden. And along the sides, you would have spring bulbs, summer perennials. So there are peonies and sweet peas and roses. The kitchen garden is also, it's very interesting because it's where gardeners grow edible plants to learn more about producing healthy and sustainable food. So they grow different varieties of common fruits and vegetables along with some of the heritage varieties and some other very unusual types of crops. Now, these latter plantings, looking at some of these, they could be very important sources of food for the future. So for example, in 2018, Kew grew a species of tomato that is much more resilient to changes in climate than normal tomatoes. So it's kind of a scientific garden as well. It's an experimental garden. They're constantly learning things here. And they also use a no-dig method, which I really love. So what they do is a layer of organic matter is added to the top of the beds. That suppresses the weeds, but it also protects the kind of bacteria, the beneficial bacteria, and some of the helpful creatures that live right below the surface. And if you garden at all, this differs from more traditional methods, because usually what would you do? You'd have your organic matter maybe, and you would dig it into the soil, right? You'd kind of scoop it into the soil. But that's time consuming, time intensive, depending on how big your garden is. And it risks damaging the soil structure because what happens when you do that is you can lose moisture under there. And you can destroy some of these creatures like worms, for instance. Worms really help mix the soil by pulling organic matter from the soil surface down into the crop bed. So it's a very interesting, low impact way, if you will, of gardening. Now, as I said, the fruits and vegetables from the kitchen garden are used in Q's restaurants today. But also, if you go out there between May and September, they have kitchen garden sales. So you can go out and buy some of the fruits and vegetables as well. Another place I wanted to point out, very near Kew Palace, is Queen Charlotte's Cottage. This is a rustic cottage. It was built as a country retreat, but not as a residence. So basically, this was used by the family for resting and taking some tea while you're out walking in the garden. So as you're strolling your gigantic garden estate, you get a little tired. You don't want to go all the way back to the palace. You could come to this little cottage that was built for Queen Charlotte and have some tea, get out of the sun, relax a little bit. The earliest description of this cottage is in a London magazine from 1774, and they said, "The Queen's cottage in the shade of the garden is a pretty retreat. The furniture is all English prints of elegance and humor, and the design is said to be Her Majesty's." At the back of the garden was a paddock, and Queen Charlotte kept Oriental cattle here, and she kept pheasants here, and you can still see some of these pheasants today around the garden, some of their ancestors. And in the early 1790s, kangaroos, which were the first to arrive in England, they were kept and successfully bred in this paddock. Now, if you took my history of London class, or even I think the first week of this course, we talked about at St. James Park, the pelicans there. The royals always had this fascination with having menageries and having interesting animals around them. So they had these kangaroos, and by the early 19th century, there were 18 of them. They had 18 kangaroos. But in 1806, the kangaroo paddock was turned into a flower garden. I don't know what happened to the kangaroos. I'm assuming they went to various zoos and things, but I've not been able to track down what happened to the kangaroos that were there. So if anyone ever finds out, let me know, because I'm still trying to find that out. The cottage was used for the last time by the royal family in 1818. At that time, it was used for the double weddings of the Duke of Clarence, later William IV, and Edward, Duke of Kent, who was the father of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria herself rarely visited the cottage, but it was maintained by a housekeeper throughout her reign, so it was still kept in good shape. And in 1898, Victoria donated Queen Charlotte's cottage and the surrounding land to Kew Gardens as part of her Diamond Jubilee celebrations. But the gift came with one special requirement. The landscape had to be left in an uncultivated state. So if you walk around this area, it's more wild. There aren't formal gardens here. There's nothing like that. It's more wild. In fact, if you look at the next, oops, it's not letting me go forward here. If you look at the next slide, this area is now called a natural area in Kew. So woodlands and these bluebells, the bluebells, I was just so lucky when I was here this one time, just bursting out in bloom. So fields of bluebells around here. So that was Victoria's requirement. You cannot put in formal gardens. You have to keep it looking kind of wilderness. Now, I mentioned some of these kind of follies or buildings that were built. The Great Pagoda is a 10-story octagonal tower. It stands 164 feet high. It was designed by Sir William Chambers and completed in 1762 as a gift for Princess Augusta. Now, at the time of its construction, it was considered so unusual that people were actually really unconvinced it would remain standing because each level is nearly 100 feet narrower than the one below it. But Chambers had studied Oriental architecture in China, but when he designed Kew's pagoda, he ignored the rules that he studied in China. So pagodas should have an odd number of floors. Traditionally, they have 7 floors rather than 10 that are here. And that's believed to represent the 7 steps to heaven. So he kind of ignored those rules. He made this one a little different, but it is still considered the most accurate reconstruction of a Chinese building in Europe at that time when he built it. It was considered the most accurate reconstruction. And it is very impressive. It underwent major restoration and was completed in July of 2018. And that included the reintroduction after 200 years of 80 dragons. Here's one of the dragons, one on each corner of each story. But the original appearance, if you had seen it when it was first built, it would have been actually much more garish than what you see today. So when it was built, the whole structure was painted a bright blue and red with these gleaming roof tiles. So not what we saw here, which is a little more subdued until you get up close and see the dragons, which are very hard to see from here. But the whole thing would have been, garish colors at that time. Now, originally flanking the pagoda were 2 equally exotic buildings, again, influenced by Chambers' foreign travels. He traveled a lot. So the Alhambra was inspired by its magnificent namesake in Granada. And it was basically a Moorish-style building. It was completed in 1758. Unlike the complex of suites that constitutes the original Alhambra, this was a simpler structure. So it's just a single room covered by a very kind of intricate, multicolored porch. It was destroyed in 1820, and now on that site is a sunken garden. And then the third, you had the pagoda, you had the Alhambra, and then you had this mosque. This was finished in 1761, and it was based on examples of Turkish Islamic architecture. It had 2 minarets, and it had stucco palm trees with leaves of straw and ribbons. Now, we don't know exactly what happened to the mosque. We don't know when it was destroyed, but we know that by 1785 it was gone. It was no longer there. So all that's left now is the pagoda. But I did want to also point this out. In the Japanese garden, where the mosque once stood, well, we know where the mosque once stood, is this Japanese gateway of the Imperial Messenger. It's a 4/5 replica of a temple structure in Kyoto, and it was created in 1910 for the Japanese-British exhibition and then relocated to Kew after the end of the exhibition. It's surrounded by traditional Japanese gardens that were designed by a professor from Osaka University, and it was open to the public in 1996. The gateway is made of Japanese hinoki cypress. Its traditional copper roof replaced the original one that was made of cedar bark. And you can see in this photo really intricate carvings in the woodwork here, carvings of animals and flowers and plants and human figures. The landscape, there are several like little gardens around this gate, around this area. So there's the Garden of Peace, a Garden of Harmony, and a Garden of Activity. So they all surround the gateway. The Garden of Activity sits at the end of the landscape, and it's interesting. So it's raked gravel. There are large pebbles, and basically it was designed to kind of mirror the movement of flowing water in waterfalls. And they used around 17 tons of gravel to complete the landscape. 17 tons is about the same weight as 3 African elephants. So that was a lot of gravel. And then you've got as I mentioned, the other gardens. The Garden of Harmony kind of has these big rocks that signify Japan's mountain regions. So here is the Garden of Activity. And obviously those pine cones did not just fall there. They were deliberately placed there. And you can see some of the raked design. They've got the little stone bridge in the background. That's because this is supposed to be water flowing under here. Kew's horticulturalists rake the gravel once a week into these waves. They make circular and straight line patterns, and again, to symbolize the movement and ripples of water. And they use wooden rakes made at Kew. Takes about an hour to rake, but the process is much slower in the autumn because leaves have fallen down and they've got to go through with a leaf blower first and get all the leaves out of the way. Each year in September or October, it kind of depends on the lunar calendar. The gravel is raked into a checkerboard pattern, and that is placed there to celebrate the Japanese tradition of autumn moon viewing. And this special design, basically, supposedly, moonlight casts shadows on here, and that's supposed to represent rice fields at harvest time. So I'm just going to show you just for a second. Here is how they rake this. So you can see the wooden rake. So it is quite it's quite a feat, and there's actually a longer video that you can watch with this music, and it's just kind of this soothing, almost meditative thing of watching them rake the garden over, I think, a 20-minute time span in that video. Oops, okay. So moving along, related to the Japanese gateway is this model of a minka house. This is in the bamboo garden. Minka houses were traditional houses lived in by ordinary Japanese until about the mid-20th century. They had wooden frames supported by mud-plastered wall panels and a thatched roof. The buildings were resistant to earthquake damage and very easy to repair. And in northern Japan, the houses had steep roofs and very small windows, and that was to help cope with the cold winters in northern Japan. In the south, the houses were small, low buildings with raised floors to sort of improve ventilation and to resist any typhoon damage. So they were created for their environments in different parts of the country. There's another photo, and you can see the roof. And there's inside, there's a look at the roof from the inside as well. All right, I mentioned a couple of these glass houses. The Temperate House that you see here, it's one of the few original largest Victorian glass houses that survive today anywhere in the world. It was commissioned in 1859 by the then director of Kew, and it was designed by an architect named Decimus Burton and opened to the public in 1863. But building this thing, the construction, the building costs really soared. So it was unfinished when it was open. It wasn't quite finished. And it took another 36 years before they finally finished it. Unfortunately, Burton did not live to see the project completed. He died 2 years before it was finally completed in 1898. But Burton was a protege of John Nash. You might remember that name when I talked about Regent's Park that was designed by Nash, or if you did the History of London lectures, John Nash worked with the Prince Regent, later George IV, on Buckingham Palace as well. So Nash designed many of its features and paths. And Burton obviously was, Burton was influenced by him. Burton designed the building and the paths. And then he designed another very famous Kew glass house, Burton did, the Palm House. That was built between 1844 and 48. And at that time, the Palm House was the largest in the world, measuring 363 feet in length, 100 feet wide, and 66 feet high. But again, before long, Burton was working on the Temperate House here, and that's twice the size of the Palm House. So it covers 6,000 square feet. It has 15,000 panes of glass, and it's 62 feet high at its tallest point. In 2013, Kew undertook a 5-year renovation of the Temperate House. That's the second renovation it's had in its life. The first one was actually done in the 1970s. But this was a huge renovation, cost 41 million pounds. Cleaning and repairs were carried out on the stonework, on the urns, on the window frames, the ironwork, the statues. It was just amazing what they found. And when they were doing the renovation, old path foundations from where the house was first built and the original underfloor heating in the south octagon, those were uncovered while they were doing this. So you can see the octagon at both sides of the structure. So renovations, 69,000 individual elements were removed from the building and they were cleaned, repaired, or replaced. 15,000 panes of glass and 800 windows were replaced. 116 urns were restored. 110 miles of scaffolding was used. 1,400 gallons of paint. There were 400 staff members and contractors who worked on different phases of this project, and it took 1,731 days to complete. Today, it contains over 4,000 plants and 1,500 plant species from the temperate regions of the world. And some of these, actually many of these, are currently rare or in danger of extinction. So here are a couple of pictures from the inside. They have this wonderful little kind of waterfall and pool area. I loved all the ironwork. The ironwork is quite interesting. All right, so within here, I want to point out a couple of plants. So this is Moresby's gum, and it's native to southeastern Tasmania, limited to only 2 small populations of 2,000 mature plants, and it produces seeds when it reaches maturity. It takes 10 years, but it produces these seeds when it reaches maturity. And they need to have an environmental trigger to be released, these seeds do. And in this case, fire is what releases the seeds. So the seeds are stored in these button-shaped pods up in a canopy, and they remain closed until a fire comes along and melts the resin, sealing them shut. And then the seeds fall to the ground, onto the kind of ash, which is very fertile, that's been left behind by the fire, and that's how they continue to grow. Very interesting. Luckily, no fires at Kew, so I don't think these guys are going to be growing. And this is also known as the loneliest tree at Kew. It's a type of plant that once dominated the planet 300 million years ago during the Jurassic period. It has a crown, you can see here, of bright green leaves, has very intricately patterned trunk on it, and these orange cones that you can see on the right. This was found in 1895 by John Medley Wood on the edge of a forest in South Africa. And it came to England in 1899. It was originally in the Palm House, and then it was moved to the Temperate House, and it coned for the first time in 2004. but it's been on its own for over 100 years. It's the only species to have ever been found in the wild that they have here. And not only does it make the plant now extinct in the wild, because that's the only one they found, it also means there's little hope of it reproducing naturally because, pollination, usually by insects, occur in the wild when a male and female plant of the same species grow close to one another. But a female version of this plant has never been discovered. And unless a female plant is found, it won't be possible for this to pollinate and naturally reproduce. So that's why it's called the loneliest tree at Kew. As I said before, the Temperate House is one of several glass houses at Kew. I mentioned Palm House. There's also the Princess of Wales Conservatory and the Davies Alpine House as well. But again, really, I got to go in here right after they finished the renovations, and it's quite wonderful to walk around. One last thing I wanted to point out before we leave Kew is this installation called the Hive. This was created by artist Wolfgang Buttress, and it represents a vast honeybee hive that highlights the importance of pollination. It's illuminated by nearly 1,000 LED lights, and it's linked to one of the beehives at Kew, which is really cool. So what this means is the lights flicker in time to the vibrations caused when the bees communicate with each other in the beehive. So it's a very fascinating structure. And that's from the inside. I took a photo from the inside looking up toward the top. Really, really a cool structure. So today, Kew is one of the few gardens placed on the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites. Within its acreage, there are no less than 36 Grade 2 listed structures, as well as 4 Grade 1 listed buildings, including the Temperate House and the Palm House, those glass houses. In addition to spectacular botanical features, Kew houses 2 museums, an education center housed in a gorgeous John Nash glass house that was actually once at Buckingham Palace, and that's been moved out here. And it also has the Orangery, which was designed by William Chambers in 1761 as a hothouse for citrus plants, but now it's a restaurant. Here are a few more pictures of Kew. And right outside Kew Gardens, if you go out here, not very far away, is a little tea house, a little tea shop called the Original Maids of Honor. I think that's the name of it. And they have really good tea there. So I would recommend afternoon tea there. This is actually in back of Kew Palace, the kind of garden behind Kew Palace. And a curious duck looking at me. Oops, jumped ahead. Okay, so we're going to come back to central London, to West London in Chelsea, which you've heard me mention before, Chelsea, the home of the Chelsea Physic Garden. The Royal Horticulture Society Chelsea Flower Show is one of the most prestigious flower shows in the world. It's a wonderful place to see cutting-edge garden designs, amazing floral displays, the newest kind of garden gadgetry if you're into gardening. It is a jam-packed place. It's one of the most crowded venues I've ever been to be honest with you. It's very, very popular when it's on. It's been held on the grounds of the Royal Hospital Chelsea every year since 1913, with the exception of during the 2 World Wars. Now, it was first called the Royal Horticulture Society Great Spring Garden Show when it opened in 1862, so before it was at the Chelsea Hospital, and it was in a large tent. And it was at that time on the grounds of the Royal Horticulture Society Garden in Kensington. That's no longer there anymore. Between 1888 and 1911, it was held in the Temple Gardens on the banks of the Thames, and then finally it moved over to the Royal Hospital Chelsea, where it's been ever since. The shows originally were these 3-day events. They were held, as I said, within a single tent Royal visits were not a tradition at that time. The king and queen did not attend in 1913 when it moved to Chelsea, but the king's mother, Queen Alexandra, who you can see here, did attend with two of her children. And while the original shows were housed within one tent, the provision of tents increased after World War I. So in 1928, there was a tent for roses. Between 1920 and 34, there was a tent for pictures, scientific exhibits, and displays of garden design. And then in the late 1920s, two residences of Chelsea, the Countess of Lovelace and Jacqueline Hope, they held tea parties for celebrities and titled guests during the show. Now, a few months ahead of the second Chelsea show, war was declared in Europe. As I said, they had a break between the wars. The show did continue in 1915, but the number of exhibitors had dropped, but they still treated it like a normal show. But then in 1916, compulsory conscription began in January of that year. So many of the Royal Horticultural Society staff members were called to war. And there was a feeling at that time, that ornamental gardening was an inappropriate indulgence at that time. So after 1916, the show was canceled for the duration of World War I. In 1919, the government demanded that the Royal Horticultural Society pay an entertainment tax for the show. They already had very strained resources, so it really did threaten the future of this show. But thankfully, this was waived once the Royal Horticultural Society convinced the government that the show had educational benefits. And in 1920, a special tent was erected to house scientific exhibits. And you can now see the scientific exhibits in one corner of the Great Pavilion, which I'll talk about later. Between the two world wars, rock gardens were put in place. These were probably the most popular feature of the show. They drew huge crowds. The show was discontinued in 1939 due to the Second World War, and the Royal Horticultural Society instead focused on their Dig for Victory campaign, basically talking about how you could grow food at home. But following the end of the Second World War in 1945, they said, okay, let's try to get this show back as quickly as possible. It did return in 1947. It was hailed as a triumph. There were far, far fewer exhibitors, but despite this, everyone loved it, and they said, this was great because it's continuing to fly the flag of British horticulture. So they were very enthusiastic about this. And then in 1951, a big change came because those individual tents were replaced by a single marquee, and it was bigger than anything that had ever been seen before at the show. It was supported by 278 tent posts. It covered almost 8 acres. And for many, many years, it was in the Guinness Book of World Records as being the world's largest tent. But in 2000, the old marquee was removed, and its remains, made up of 12 acres of canvas, were recycled into 7,000 handbags, jackets, and aprons. And at that time, it was replaced by the Grand Pavilion. That's a structure of almost 3 acres. That's still there today. Now, in the 1950s, Elizabeth II came to the throne. Well, actually, she was already on the throne by the 1950s, but she was made a royal patron of the RHS in June of 1952. And she made her first visit to the show as queen in 1955. And that started this tradition of royalty visiting the show every year. So royalty attend every year now. And both royalty and celebrities get special access to the show the day before it opens to the public. I would love to get in here the day before it opens to the public. And actually, royalty have also been involved in creating some of the gardens. So Prince Harry created an African garden one year, and the now Princess of Wales, then Duchess of Cambridge, Kate Middleton, she created a garden in here as well. But it's very common now that royalty come and they go through the garden. The arrival of the 1960s also welcomed Chelsea as the largest display of orchids ever staged at the show. There were 5,000 square feet of orchid stands and displays. And you can see this photo here is from 2018. And that year they had, when I was there, they had this amazing peacock made out of all these orchids. This is in the Grand Pavilion here. But so orchids became very, very, very popular. And then you started seeing the rock gardens I mentioned before. These were replaced by tree and shrub gardens. Bonsai trees became very popular in the 1960s. We started seeing those as well. You may have heard me mention Beth Chatto. I think I mentioned her last week or the week before. So in the 1970s, what we started seeing was this rise in celebrity garden designers, people who began appearing on TV and kind of becoming celebrities in their own right. Legendary plantswoman Beth Chatto on the left here, she made her first appearance in 1976, and the following year saw her win the first of 10 consecutive Chelsea Gold medals. In 1979, the show became so crowded that admissions were prevented for the first time in the show's history. And I can believe it because, as I said, when I was there in 2018, you could barely move for all the people that were there. In the 1990s, we saw the arrival of these themed gardens, these kind of conceptual gardens. And they were created to, as it says, express a theme. And those are some of the most interesting ones today that you can see. Here's a plasticine garden. This is one of James May's gardens made of plasticine. It didn't win any awards, but people wanted it to win an award, so he was given a special RHS gold medal, a special one, because of this very unique and unusual kind of garden that he created. If you could call it a garden, it is plasticine. Garden gnomes have been forbidden throughout the Royal Horticultural Society's Chelsea's history, but in 2013, the ban was temporarily lifted to celebrate the show's 100th birthday. And what they did then was they had celebrities again, people like Elton John, Dame Helen Mirren, Joanna Lumley, another actress, and Mary Berry. If you ever watched the old Great British Bake Off shows, Mary Berry was one of the judges. They painted gnomes to sell for charity. So you can see some of those gnomes here. So, some facts and figures. It may be the most prestigious garden show in the world, but it's not the largest. That accolade actually goes to the Royal Horticultural Society Hampton Court Palace Garden Festival. That takes place every summer, so they have a similar type of thing out at Hampton Court. The show gardens, as you see here, 500 worldwide exhibitors, so people come from all over the world to do these. There are over 100 exhibits in the Grand Pavilion, that gigantic 3-acre site. There are over 250 shops that you can purchase things from. The show gardens are built from scratch in 19 days, and then they're dismantled in 5 days. And this is really amazing. This show, the other thing they do with this show, it's so popular in Britain, every night there are, actually afternoon and evening, I think for the entire run of the show, there's an afternoon live feed, a live show from there, and there's an evening one as well. And you can see them as they're building the gardens. They show how they're building the gardens. They talk to the gardeners as they go along. I love watching it. They used over 2,000 tons of dirt, earth is moved in preparation for the show. So they're constantly bulldozing and moving earth out of the way to create these gardens. Quite a thing to see. There are 14 judges, 2 moderators, and it takes 24 hours to judge and assess all the gardens in the show. Now, speaking of all the work they have to go through to put these gardens in the short amount of time they have to do them in, and you have to think about sometimes the elements are against you, but you still got to get your garden designed and built in that time. Garden designers, there's apparently a thing called the Chelsea flu. So a garden designer named Nina Baxter, she once told the Guardian newspaper, it's difficult to concentrate because you got these trucks continuously going past. People are cutting stone, you're getting covered in dust. But the worst is when the plane trees on the main avenue dump their pollen, and that's the time of year they dump them. She said, it's horrible. You get it in the back of your throat, you get it in your eyes, and they call it the Chelsea flu. And everyone really hopes that there's going to be this big, strong wind overnight, so it kind of takes all the pollen off the trees all at once. But that, of course, seldom happens. So I mentioned, judges and awards and medals. So this is really interesting. So these awards go to gardeners who have shown impressive skills across 4 categories. So there are show gardens, space to grow gardens, fresh gardens, and artisan gardens. And then they have other awards, the plant of the year, the best discovery exhibit. There are awards for flower arrangements. You name it, they've got it. And lately they've been doing, and I don't know if that's listed in these four, maybe the Space to Grow one is one of them. They've been showing highlighting little tiny gardens, little tiny, like your patio garden. The judging panel represents a wide cross-section of landscaping, horticultural, and design expertise. They are supposed to give a balanced opinion on the judging process. The judges all have to be accredited through a Royal Horticulture Society training process, but they're independent of the Royal Horticulture Society. And there's a three-part process. There's assessing, there's judging, and there's moderation. So the Saturday before the show opens, usually the show opens, I think, on a Tuesday, if I recall. I think Monday is the day that the celebrities and the and royalty get to go in for free, get to go in ahead of time. So the Saturday before, a small team of assessing judges visit the gardens, and a representative from the garden, it could be a designer, it could be the sponsor of the garden, because these gardens are all sponsored, or a contractor, whoever is most appropriate. They will have 2 minutes to present and highlight any development of the garden since they submitted their initial brief. So the gardeners will submit a brief. This is what we want to do. This is the theme. This is what we're trying to show. Those briefs are accepted. They're invited to build a garden. Then while they're in their building, as I said, they have 2 minutes on that Saturday before to talk to them about, okay, this is where we are. This is how we've come along. After the presentation, exhibitors will be asked to vacate the garden while the garden's being assessed. And the assessing judges will look at the garden and they'll say, okay, how is this meeting the brief? Is this the standard that we want for each of, for the garden? And then they make a medal recommendation. And then following that, they write notes, they make their initial assessment, they make their recommendations, and they pass it along to the judging panel. And the criteria is wide. So again, the initial brief, the design, the concept, the originality, the layout, the construction, because these aren't just gardens, as you'll see in a minute. I mean, they're actually pieces of architecture in some cases. So there's a lot that goes into this, and there's a whole point system that goes along with it. And then it's moved to the judging panel. The judging panel comprises 3 of the assessing judges and 4 additional judges. They go in and they visit the finished gardens on Sunday. And again, they're looking at all, has it met the brief? Has it done this? Did they do what they say they're going to do? But also, each garden is judged on its own merit. So not against other gardens, but against the brief that was submitted to the judges. So that's how they judge it. And again, more notes are taken, more recommendations are made. And then if they have a problem, if the judges have a problem, if they disagree, they can call for further discussion. They can call for a revote. But only once the entire panel agrees can the medal be awarded. And only one garden gets, the garden of the year, basically, the real garden. Then there's a moderator. That's an experienced judge. That person goes along with the judging panel to ensure that there's consistency of the criteria and to confirm the medals awarded. The garden with the highest score will automatically win Best in Show. But if 2 or more gardens score the same, the judges will propose and then vote on their own Best in Show. And it's only again, when they've come to an agreement that they can finally reach a final agreement. So there are gold medals, silver guild, silver, and bronze medals. Those are the medals that are given out. And the number of gold medals awarded varies from year to year. I think in 2018, when I was there, 10 gold medals were awarded during that time. But you can see the judging panel here all talking. And here are some, as I said, it's not just the flowers. I mean, these gardens are insane. These themed gardens are absolutely insane. So you're building everything from scratch, bringing in everything. And often the gardens, the themed gardens, this one was a particular interest to me because this was from a Syrian charity, I think. So often these gardens are also, they have healing gardens, they have health gardens, and often they're sponsored by, or they're in, they're for some sort of charity of some type. And at the end, all of these structures are taken down, everything is destroyed, everything is carted away, and there's no vestige of any of it left. So imagine building that in 19 days. And this is inside the pavilion, the grand pavilion. And I loved this woman because she almost blended in with she really embraced the garden look here when she came to visit, including her hat. Okay, the last thing I wanted to mention, if you do go to the Chelsea Flower Show, and even if you don't, if you just decide, oh, I don't want to spend the money, I don't want to get in those crowds. If you're out in Chelsea, in association with this Royal Horticulture Society show, there's an annual competition centered on themed floral displays. And you can walk around the streets of Chelsea, the shops, the restaurants, the hotels. They go to town with these creative designs, again, to try to win awards. So in 2018, the theme was the Summer of Love. And that referenced both the San Francisco Haight-Ashbury movement in the 1960s, but also the 2018 wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, because the Chelsea Flower Show was, I think, literally the week after their wedding. So here are some shots I took walking around Chelsea. And they get, again, very inventive. It's really kind of fun. I like this one, the Volkswagen bus and the double-decker Summer of Love. Okay, that is all from me. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'll turn on my camera and I will see who we have here. Let's see. Oops, let's see the chat. Oh, thank you, Lorraine. Yeah, the Chelsea Flower Show is quite special. And again, I have to say, it was outdoors, but I've never seen those pictures I took of some of those show gardens. I had to stand forever and work my way through about 7 deep of people to get close enough to get those photos without anybody in front. It was insane. I mean, it was just, I went to the royal wedding the week before and it was not nearly as crowded as this place. I mean, it was just, yeah, it was nuts, but I'm glad I did it. I don't think I need to do it again. I'll watch it on TV in the future. All I need to do is see the TV, but it
Deb,
was, yeah.
I just wanted to say I was talking about the out of the 4 series, that you did.
Oh, this
That
one. Okay.
yes.
Oh, you like this the best. Okay, well, good. Good. I'm glad. I'm glad you like this one the best. But
Yep.
yeah, yeah. Um, any questions or comments or other thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Deb. This was great. And I loved the kitchen garden.
Oh, I
That
did
was nice.
too. I
Yeah,
tell you, I love that. It was just it's such a beautiful little garden. And it's so, they've got the wicker beehives and I mean, just they've got the wooden carts and yeah, oh, I love that garden. I love that garden.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you
I'm
so
definitely
much.
going to
This
go
is
back
great.
and watch it all over again. This is going
Oh,
to
well,
Yep.
good. Well, again, like everything else, it's just a snapshot. There's so many beautiful gardens and so many things that could be covered, but I was trying to chunk them out into different types and try to do a representation. So glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, and if you get out to if you get out to Windsor, when we went out to Windsor, we were in London for like 5 weeks, and we had already made these plans months in advance, not knowing that Prince Harry was getting married. I mean, this was before he was even engaged. And then as it turns out, I said, oh, we're going to be out there. you know, when he's getting married. We're going to be in London. So I said to my husband, we got to go out to Windsor. We got to see if we can. And it was almost impossible to find a place to stay because the minute they announced the wedding date and that it was going to be at Windsor, but we got a bedroom with a private bathroom in a house owned by this really delightful family in Egham, which was about a, I don't know, 60 to 90-minute walk in from there. But the husband drove us. He goes, here's where you go to get to the gates of Windsor Great Park. You walk through here, you turn here, you turn here. Then you're right at the top of the long walk. You can walk right down through. And then the day before the wedding, he said, well, why don't you just stay and watch it with us? All our kids are coming home. We're going to have a barbecue. And I'm like, no, we came out from London. It's our anniversary. I really want to, I'm here. I want to see it live. So we did, and it took about 90 minutes to walk in. And it was really fun because there were actually Prince Harry and Prince William passed us in a car. I guess heading to from Old Windsor someplace. Because I said, who are that? Everybody was taking pictures. Oh, that was William and Harry. And then I saw some little kid. It's a very affluent area, as you can imagine, leading up to this park. Mansions behind gated doors. But here's this little kid, and he's living in basically this mansion with this huge gate, but he's sitting out there selling water at 6:30 in the morning. For like £1 a bottle of water. I'm like, you know something, kid? You probably don't need the money, but what the heck? I'll buy a bottle off you. You
Yeah.
got up at 6 in the morning, you're out here selling water. Good for you. You know, a little entrepreneur. So I bought my bottle of water. And then when we walked down in there, I mean, the walk was just gorgeous. It's just walking down that long walk, and you can see the castle from, it feels like miles and miles away. And then we got down there, and they had lots and lots of security. And we had to get there very, very early. And they had big TV screens. We weren't by one of the TV screens, so I couldn't actually see the wedding, but I watched it later. A friend recorded it for me. But they were selling champagne. They were selling the flavor of the wedding cake. So it was just this very fun kind of, very, very fun. But walking around that area, and they've got a beautiful farm shop there too, a really nice farm shop that you can go in and buy produce and things. But it's that whole Windsor Great Park area is just amazing. Just in and of itself, it's great. So yeah, that was fun. So if you get out there, try to spend a couple days. If you go to the castle, spend another day and walk around the grounds. It's really worth it.
Great.
Any other comments? Well, thank you so much for coming and
Thank
sitting
you.
4 weeks. I appreciate it. And I'm glad we got through it without losing my computer flickered at 1 second there. And I'm like, uh-oh, but I didn't lose it. So that was good. We made it through. So enjoy the rest of your day, and
Thank you.
see you again sometime, somewhere, maybe another course. We'll see what happens, but take care. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Deb.
Bye-bye.